Welcome to the third session of this second book club. As you know, we're calling it Reasoned Argument, the Counter to Cancel Culture. So tonight, the subject matter is Cicero and Justice Scalia. Now that may seem an odd pairing given how far apart they are in terms of time. They may be apart in time, but they were not apart in either education or in devotion to Republicanism. What do they have in common besides the fact that they're both Italian? Well, for one thing, Justice Scalia had a heavy classical education. 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek. And of course, in any Latin course, series of courses, you're going to study Cicero. No question about it. So he was very familiar with Cicero, and indeed, there are many marks from Cicero's approach to things, his oratory and his writing, that you can see reflected in Justice Scalia. Now, why the emphasis again on classical learning? Well, for one thing, remember when we were looking at Jefferson's letter to Henry Lee in the last session regarding his comments about the origin or his thinking on the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And I've highlighted here the writers, the thinkers that he cited. He said Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney, okay? They were familiar, that is, at least the leadership was familiar with these kinds of thinkers and writers. And the first two are Aristotle and Cicero. So there's no doubt about that. And what we want to do is to trace it. But you may say, look, that's great, but back then, in order to get into college, you had to have already the Greek and the Latin. And how many people have that today? Justice Scalia may have had it. We can't work on the assumption that most people have it, even if it would be desirable if some more people had it. But one of the things we're going to see through the following 10 sessions is that Cicero influenced all of these writers, and that you can object, well, you know, they were wealthy, white, and privileged. That's not true. That classical education penetrated all the way down. And in fact, the last two, Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, they were self-educated. And as it's stated in a book by Professor Stauffer, underlined on this slide, Lincoln and Douglass actually were bonded in advance of their meeting. But the fact that they had read, probably memorized, the same 6 books. And as we'll discuss later on with Frederick Douglass, the first book he looked at was a book on rhetoric. That's where he started. Now, the think points, as I call them, for tonight are 1, Cicero and Republicanism. 2, the meaning and elements of rhetoric, Cicero and Scalia. And 3, the challenges to reasoned rhetorical argument in America today. So before I play this piece from the Royal Shakespeare Company, realize that the figure of Cicero, especially during the 17th and 18th centuries, was very large. We can't imagine it in many ways today, the impact he had on the culture. So in order to recreate this in a way for modern minds, we're going to look at the trailer for a series of plays being done by the Royal Shakespeare Company.
My name is Robert Harris, and I wrote the trilogy of novels about Cicero that the 2 plays are based on. I think the cleverness of the adaptation is that it both reflects pretty accurately the books themselves, and yet takes them into a different dimension. They come alive in a different way. And it's a real Rolls-Royce production.
Let's talk about power. I'm writing a life of the Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator of his age, some say of any age. He faced powerful opposition, from Catiline, brutal, ambitious, and from a young chancellor called Gaius Julius Caesar. All Cicero had was his voice. He turned it into the most powerful instrument of political persuasion in the Republic.
So we've talked about Cicero the philosopher. Now, in terms of republicanism, we need to talk about Cicero the hero. What made his philosophy spread was the fact that he became famous as the hero of Rome, and then famous at the time of our founding for his defense of republicanism. And so therefore his ideas had greater appeal to people than they might otherwise have had. So Cicero was a person who we've already said was a lawyer, philosopher, statesman, poet, everything you could imagine. He is the all-around person, quite accomplished. Very few people can have that kind of impact. But it's important to have models to look up to. Not something so much that happens today, except unless you're a sports hero, and that's great, or if you happen to be, quote, a celebrity, however ridiculous that may be. What happens is you become known. Well, Cicero was known for his great accomplishments. That's the whole point. But to understand his accomplishments, we must turn to a little bit of background. And as we look at here, the background, we'll better understand the concerns of the framers.
We've met Cicero as a thinker, as a man who was a conduit for Greek philosophy into Roman life, as a constitutional theorist of a mixed constitution and of a balanced constitution, as a theorist of justice with profound and influential ideas of what justice is and how it fits into a view of natural law and constitutional order. But Cicero was not just a man of ideas, he was a man of action. And in the year 64, his political career was reaching new and truly unexpected heights. Cicero was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, meaning he was someone who had no ancestors, who had served in the Roman Senate. Cicero was born a wealthy Roman, an eques, an equestrian, a knight, the second highest order in the Roman aristocracy. But he'd risen through his remarkable talents to the very heights of Roman society, and in the year 64, sought to reach the pinnacle of Roman power within the Republican Constitution. He ran for the office of consul, and in the year 64, during the campaign, he found himself face to face with a candidate who represented the most radical strains in the populist faction of Roman politics, a man named Catiline. And in the year 64, the campaign itself turned towards extremism and violence. And so Cicero, in his political thought, is deeply informed by his own experiences as a politician. Catiline ran for office on a radical populist platform. He promised to redistribute land and, just as importantly, cancel debts. Now, think of what this means in terms of a political platform. Catiline runs for office promising to redistribute land and to cancel debts. Now, imagine if you're a creditor and there's someone running for consul who's promising to cancel the debts. That is a radical promise. If you're a debtor, then you like this platform. Imagine in our own society if someone ran for presidential office on the platform of canceling the debts. Imagine that. Who would oppose it? The banks, people with capital. Who would support it? People with mortgages, people with credit card debt, people with college loans. This is a platform that would be, even in our own context, extremely dangerous. And as unthinkable as it may be, in the Roman world, it was a reality that a major politician was campaigning on a promise to undo the relations of debt and credit that existed at that moment in society, arguing that they had become usurious, that these loans had been made unfairly, and that they were oppressing the poor classes, that they were oppressing the common man, who was the backbone of the republic. And it was a very real political platform in a society with deep divisions of wealth. That kind of radicalism is inherently dangerous in a political society. And certainly in Roman society, it threatened to tear the fabric of this world apart. And the campaign in 64 became itself full of extremism and radical claims and tensions.
So that's the background, but how could that possibly be a model for the United States, for our Constitution? That is, they had an unwritten Constitution. They didn't have separation of powers. They didn't have federalism as we know it, at least. What they had was something different. They had a powerful Senate from which they elected two councils each year. And those councils had full power. They were the executive, but it only lasted for a year. And it happened to be that in the year that Cicero was consul, we had this terrible conspiracy to overthrow the republic. So it is in that context that we're going to hear the rest of this and how the story goes.
And through the support of the wealthy classes, Cicero, as a polished speaker, as an accomplished politician, as someone who campaigned on a platform of social harmony to preserve the interests and property rights of those with land and those with capital, was carried on to victory and entered the office of consul. But the threat of Catiline didn't subside. And in fact, rumors began to swirl almost immediately that Catiline wasn't content to accept the results of the election, that he saw it as illegitimate, that the wealthy had bought this campaign, and that the just course of action was in fact to overthrow Cicero and to carry out his platform to restore the republic by redistributing land and canceling the debts. And almost from his first moments after being elected, Cicero began to hear rumors of a possible revolt orchestrated by Catiline, although taking shape in the hills north of Rome, in Etruria, what's now Tuscany, where it was said an army of debtors and slaves and veterans was being raised that would march on Rome itself and overthrow the government of Cicero. Catiline denied this and in fact remained in the city of Rome, even though the rumors said that he was the architect of this rebellion. And we know about this episode in detail, not only from a Roman historian of the period, but also from the speeches and writings of Cicero himself, whose speeches in this period he would later polish and publish, the Catilinarian orations, some of the most famous Latin texts ever written. And Cicero, in a very famous speech, what's known as the first Catilinarian oration, tries to shame Catiline, to make Catiline feel that everyone knows that he is a rebel and that he is plotting sedition against the state. And indeed, the force of his oratory was so powerful that Cicero is able to convince Catiline that he is known, that he's exposed, and forces Catiline's hand, who in fact was plotting a rebellion. And he leaves the city, meets his forces in the north, and a battle ensues. In fact, the rebels under Catiline and the armies of the state under the ultimate command of Cicero meet in the field of battle. Catiline himself is killed, and Cicero is victorious. He's hailed as the father of the fatherland, the savior of his country, and he's instantly a hero.
So here's the problem. We have a model in Cicero and others. Cato, the play Cato, was also very important, as Forrest McDonald writes, in terms of shaping the understanding of republicanism at the time of the founding. But even though they were competitors, Cicero and Cato, they are instrumental in their memory and stories about them shaping the founding. But did that mean that everybody at the founding was somehow very well read? No, not at all. As in most societies, you have gradations in terms of education. It's true today still. It was certainly true back then. So let's look at what Forrest McDonald says in Novus Ordo Seclorum about how it was that Republicanism penetrated the culture at the time. What Forrest McDonald does is to talk about the problems created by independence. That is, in a way, Republicanism was something new to them, even though there had been some who were educated on Republicanism simply because of the writings that they had familiar with. In this particular slide, McDonald focuses on Montesquieu, who became critical in the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, both of them citing Montesquieu and saying they were being faithful to Montesquieu. But also David Hume was an important influence, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, especially on Hamilton and also Madison. He's cited and followed a good bit in the Federalist Papers. But there are others in regional sections, in particular in New England, as McDonald points to their reading of Algernon Sidney, John Milton, of course, and James Harrington. But the question of all of this republicanism is further addressed by Professor Barnett, and something I stress heavily when teaching Federalist Papers. The really critical, the most famous of the Federalist Papers is Federalist number 10 by Madison. And this is not something that he wrote just at the moment of the Federalist Papers. He had essentially given this same presentation in the convention itself, at least according to his notes he did. But he had read so much about the history of governments, and in particular republics, that he was very concerned about the problem of faction. And in having that concern, he anticipated and identified and avoided a problem that has plagued almost every country in the world that has gained independence after some form of revolution. The tendency is for the revolters to join during the revolution, but then quickly afterwards, when the enemy is gone, they fall into, quote, factions. That is, different groups. This happened in the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia. It happened in Poland. It happens everywhere. Why? As long as they're a common enemy, you have something to unite you. After the common enemy is gone, you discover your differences. That occurred in the United States, but to a much lesser degree. After the Constitution was implemented, supported and advocated by Madison, but also supported by Jefferson. And when Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison were in the Washington cabinet, they discovered that they didn't agree on certain things, namely the National Bank and other policies that Hamilton was promoting. In other words, they fell into different factions, out of which ultimately parties spring. But none of this was really violent the way it has been in some other countries, because in large part, Madison anticipated the problem and dealt with it in Federalist 10. But that understanding really undergirds the whole understanding of the Constitution. Why? Madison's solution is ultimately what we have called pluralism. But more of that if you go back and look at the book club on the Federalist Papers. But let's look down with Barnett at the last of the paragraphs on this slide. As we've already seen, Madison was not alone in identifying democracy as the source of the nation's ills. Now, this seems very odd to us today. How could you say that democracy is the source of the ills? Well, the problem was that they had different ideas about what republicanism is. So let me go to then the actual language from Federalist 10 and elaborate a little bit. So what was happening in some of the states was the same debtor-creditor conflict that was described by Professor Harper as occurring in Rome. So the key to creating the American Republic is avoiding the problems that ultimately brought down the Roman Republic. That's why the book Novus, Ordo, Seclorum has that title. It is a new order for the ages. So yes, they drew from Rome, but Rome didn't have separation of powers. They get that from Montesquieu, who got it in part from Locke, and the intellectual intertwinings are very, very interesting. But ultimately, for our purposes, what Madison was focusing on is the excessively democratic actions by government in the states under their new constitutions written after the Declaration of Independence. So he identifies the following in this highlighted language and his solution to it: a rage for paper money, for abolition of debts, mentioned by Harper, others mentioning it today, for an equal division of property, again mentioned by Harper and mentioned today, or for any other improper or wicked project, will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the movement. That is, for Madison, at least at this point in his career, the separation of the states is not so much about enhancing their power as it is about serving as a kind of quarantine. We're familiar with quarantines these days. Quarantine is intended to keep a disease, in this case, the disease of democracy, from spreading from one state to another. That is the structure of our Constitution as originally created. It's an architecture over the states, as well as a limitation of power in the federal government. It's a limitation of power everywhere. That's what Federalist 51 is all about. The double checking, the ability to have power against power in order to protect liberty. So, back again to McDonald. Some Americans took their republicanism neat, meaning like whiskey, directly from whom? People we've already talked about: Cicero, Livy, Tacitus. Among the Greeks, Demosthenes, Aristotle, Polybius, and most importantly, at least or most widely, the writing of Plutarch's Lies. Interestingly, I read recently the President Harry Truman kept in his desk a copy of the book Plutarch's Lies for its analysis of political personality types. Apparently, it's still very useful. The most important secondhand sources of Republican thought imbibed by the Americans were the works of 16th century Italians, most notably Machiavelli. Machiavelli, not always known as having a good reputation in the sense of his willingness to use power sometimes for any purpose. And the assortment of 18th century thinkers, Trenchard and Gordon, Bolingbroke, Montesquieu again, and Hume again. So that may have been how the intellectuals or the people who are highly well educated came to it. But it's really important that ordinary people understand republicanism. I mentioned before, and it's mentioned in Novus Ordo, that the play Cato is very important. It was very popular in England, and it was played many times in the United States, and Washington had it performed for his troops. So the idea of constantly banging the drum of republicanism, even if there was a lack of clarity about exactly what that meant, was significant at the time. Most patriots, however, came to republicanism as the nation did, which is to say late and willy-nilly, with neither an historical nor a philosophical understanding of what they were embracing. Imagine that. Republicanism to most meant government of the sort to which they were accustomed, but without the royal or proprietary officials, or it meant the kind they thought existed in England, except that all the branches were to be elective, or it was simply a negative concept, meaning the absence of hereditary status, or most commonly it meant representative democracy. Then between 1776 and 1787, increasing numbers of public men took the trouble to read about the history of republics and to study the writings of theorists of republicanism, and many so displayed their erudition in orations. Now, what we're attempting to do is to go back and recover that history. Now, I know that Americans are always focused on the future, and that's been very productive for the United States. But if you lose your foundation, there's not going to be much of a future. And there have been revivals at times, not only in the area of religion, but there are revivals in terms of thought leaders and as to what they said and how it might be beneficial for today. So I want to go into Montesquieu and compare him to Aristotle for a minute. Why? This is important because it's this shift from Aristotle to Montesquieu, which has a lot of consequences, at least in trying to understand the relationship between ancient republics and our modern republic as we understand it in the United States. So I will give in the next slide how Aristotle taught that governments were divided. But first, we're going to go through Montesquieu's division because they're specifically non-Aristotelian. That is, Montesquieu was a man of the Enlightenment, and he looked at government forms differently. And the difference was, unlike Aristotle, he did not divide the forms in terms of whether they were good or bad. But we'll see that he had, first of all, republics, but they could be either democratic or aristocratic. Now, the first American political party founded by Madison and Jefferson is called the Democratic Republican Party, okay? It comes directly from this division. Now, the Federalist Party, which was not necessarily all-inclusive of those who were Federalists before the ratification of the Constitution, Madison was at that point a Federalist, but he starts his own party later. They don't have real parties at this point until Madison starts the Democratic Republican Party. They were more like factions, and they might drift from one faction to another, as Madison did. By implication, though, if Jefferson and Madison, who oppose Hamilton, are the Democratic Republicans, the implication is that Hamilton is on the side of the aristocratic Republicans. The other two are monarchies and despotisms. Now, the interesting thing is that monarchies and despotisms all are generally run by one person. That's a different way of looking at this than Aristotle. So how did Aristotle look at it? Here's a schematic on Aristotle's forms of government. And from these forms grew out in the Middle Ages and including England ultimately, the so-called mixed form of government. So on the side on the left here, it's a division in terms of the one, the few, and the many. So there's a good form of the one, the few, and the many, and there's a bad form of the one, the few, and the many. The good form of the one is a monarchy. The bad form is a tyranny. The good form of the few is an aristocracy. The bad form is an oligarchy. The good form of the many is a polity, and the bad form is a democracy. For most Americans today, they tend to use aristocracy and oligarchy interchangeably. And aristocracies can become oligarchic. What's the difference between the two? It's not their membership per se, it is their way they govern. Do they govern for the good of all, or do they govern simply for their own interests? But recognizing that people, in fact, mix together their own interests and sometimes with the public good. What a mixed government does is to take the one, the few, and the many and put them together. So in England, the one was the monarch, the few was the House of Lords, and the many was the House of Commons. And after 1688, 1689, the monarchy remained and still remains, but it has mostly symbolic and historic and ceremonial purposes. So there's no real power in the British monarch and hasn't been for centuries. The few, in England, it was the House of Lords. They had power at one time, but basically, as Justice Scalia says, they have become merely honorific. You get a title of being a lord, but it doesn't carry with it any real political power. Instead, the many, the House of Commons, that's where the power in England is. So in the United States, we did not use this same approach. That is, what we did was to deal with the one, the few, and the many in a different way. Certainly, the president is the one, and deliberately one rather than multiple. The few, the Senate is the few, relatively speaking, because it's only 2 senators per state. The House grew quite a bit until 1921. We limited the number of House members to 425. So what you have is an element of the one, the few, and the many, but not in the same way. Why? In England, the one, the few, and the many was based on class. In the United States, the one, the few, and the many aren't based on class. Anybody can be president. Abraham Lincoln was considered by many people to be, quote, white trash back then. So he could be president. In the House, as is shown by what Tocqueville said in Democracy in America, there were ordinary people in the House, but the Senate was different. It was an elite body. Doesn't quite fit that description these days, unfortunately. But that's the difference. So we created a form of government not based on class, still dealing with the one, the few, and the many through separation of powers between the one, the executive, the few and the many in the Congress, and then a separate but equal branch in the judiciary. In other words, our republicanism aimed at the same goals as earlier republics, but because circumstances had changed, and also there was much new learning about how things could be improved. The ultimate aim of our government has always been stability, liberty, individual rights, and it is protected by the structure. Yes, as Justice Scalia says, the Bill of Rights is the icing on the cake, but without the structure, there'd be no reality to the protection of rights. In the second section, we want to define and clarify the elements of rhetoric. First of all, rhetoric generally has a bad name, but we'll clarify that as we go along. I'm going to begin with a reference in the book, Making Your Case by Justice Scalia and Brian Garner. This is an early quote in which they're essentially saying, look, the published advice on persuading judges goes way back, and he cites Aristotle, Socrates, Demosthenes, Cicero, and Quintilian. Well, we've been talking about Aristotle and Cicero already. So why not use this book? Well, contrary to what they say when they modestly say you can't really put forward much that's new, the reality is they put forward a lot that's new. Why aren't we using that book? Because it's specifically persuading judges. And that's only one form of rhetoric, and not everybody watching this program is ever going to be in the front of a judge. That's not the point. Moreover, the kind of rhetoric in court is called forensic rhetoric. And I'm more focused on, for purposes of this book club, what's called deliberative rhetoric. So Scalia, Justice Scalia really followed Cicero in many ways, and this quote kind of captures it. They quote this on page 112, Cicero saying, in everything, monotony is the mother of boredom. Whatever you want to say about Justice Scalia, he was never boring. So let's go to Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Well, that may sound easy, but it depends upon the particular case. The reason why public rhetoric is more challenging often is that they do not have as clear a setting of what the sources are for your argument. So one of the important things to deal with in terms of the bad name that rhetoric has in the minds of many people is to compare it to dialectic. Now, those who have gone to law school ought to know dialectic, or at least they know the name, the Socratic method. Socratic method, named after Socrates, was where Socrates used the dialectical method of questioning and conversation in order to achieve truth. Unfortunately, in law school, nobody ever seems to tell students what's going on because many walk away. I know they've told me from other classes, they walk away with the impression that if you can argue both sides, there's no real morality involved and you can do anything you want within a certain parameter. It doesn't matter. There's a sense that there's no real ethics to argument. That was one of the reasons Socrates criticized it. And Aristotle came around and pointed out and basically saved rhetoric, if you will. So dialectic and rhetoric are both neutral tools. They can be used for good purposes and bad purposes. Writing is a neutral tool, depending on how you write. That's what we're talking about, writing and arguing. In any event, the neutral tool, like a knife, can be used to cut steak or it can be used to stab somebody. It's hot. It's in the hands of the person using it. So there are three means of persuasion Aristotle talks about. First is logos, logic. Second is pathos, emotion, empathy. And third is ethos, character. I talked about these briefly before, but I want to pick up on ethos because Justice Scalia makes this point in the book that we've just covered or mentioned. Aristotle further noted that character makes a special difference on disputed points. We believe good men more fully and readily than we believe others. This is true. Where exact certainty is impossible and opinions are divided. Your objective in every argument, says Scalia and Garner, therefore, is to present yourself worthy of trust and affection. Now, that is done by your behavior and especially by the words you use. So character is not just your personal character. It is the words you use. Someone who may not have a sterling character may be a sterling lawyer, and somebody who has a sterling character as a lawyer may not be believable because in some manner sloppy. Okay, now I'm turning to the Canons of Cicero. I realize that we're going quickly through this, but remember that this is a whole course in rhetoric taught in some places these days. I'm talking about rhetoric, not, quote, communication, because communication is a much broader thing that I'll talk more about later. Anyway, Cicero, again, in the Roman style, is formalizing what was less formal in the way that Aristotle talked about it. So he has 5 things: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. In reality, these all overlap. That is to say, invention, in my mind, is the most critical thing. It's putting the argument together. So it depends on your audience and your form as to what you're going to do in each one of these. So invention. Well, first of all, it depends, as I said, on the 3 types of argument. There's forensic, that's courtroom. So your audience is either a judge or a judge and a jury, or a judge or several judges on appeal. So this is called forensic oratory and forensic rhetoric. And people who argue in both trial courts and appellate courts, they know that the rhetoric appropriate in appellate court is much more restrained and less emotional than it should be and can be in a trial court. Deliberative rhetoric, where I said I'm focusing, is to persuade people to make a judgment about something by way of action in the future. Epidictic is about praise or blame. We're not going to really go over that. I'll make a couple of mentions of examples. I'll give them now and may give them again later. Reagan's speech on the anniversary of D-Day in France, the speech was called "The Boys Upon the Hawk." He was praising their service. It is listed among the greatest speeches of all time. Anyway, back to forensic and deliberative. I want to point out that under forensic, our understanding of law, not just with our own Constitution, but all the way back, is that forensic is arguing about what happened in the past and whether it conforms to the law. The focus of deliberative is future. It focuses on public action, usually or often, and that focus is about policy. What should we be doing? We separate those powers in our government in a way that is not always separate in other governments for the reason, as explained in the Federalist, to avoid tyranny. But consider this, when our judges, federal judges in particular these days, talk about being policy oriented, that is the same as saying I'm legislatively oriented. Policy is the creation for the future, not the past. That's where we have gone off. And this is not just a matter of originalism. It's a matter fundamental to the whole notion of the rule of law. Arrangement in forensic or appellate court rules will largely lay out the basic arrangement. In juries cases, you have some rules, but they're less restrictive than you find in appellate courts. And it's not because one is looser than the other per se, it is the function. I'll talk more about juries in the next session when we go over James Otis in particular. So deliberative rhetoric does not necessarily have a particularized arrangement, is the point. Here is arrangement that you might see in the rules of appellate briefing, including in the Supreme Court. You state the issue first, then you go to the opinion of the lower court, then you go on to the summary of the argument, you lay out the facts, and then you make your argument using your authorities. That's the proof. That's what makes it reasonable. That's why it's not just emotion. So for both written and oral argument, Cicero advises this, and again quoted in Scalia and Garner. Cicero advised that you must not spring at once into the fact-specific part of your presentation, since it forms no part of the question, and men are at first desirous to learn the very point that is to come under their judgment. What do you want to do? What is the end game here? Remember, in going through the Declaration, I started at the ending deliberately. You've got to know what the judgment is, what the argument is moving toward, what judgment. So what I want to do here is, in part, have a reading by the actor that I had earlier, named John Spud McDonald. And what he's going to do is read the opening of Cicero's argument to the Senate in the famous Cadillac Oration. And in this, we're not going to have words typed out as we did for the Declaration, because the Declaration is primarily read, but then it is secondarily spoken. Here, Cicero speaking in the grand style, and we can't see him, obviously, but the attention that I want you to pay to is understanding the words as spoken.
When, O Catiline, do you mean to cease abusing our patience? How long is that madness of yours still to mock us? When is there to be an end of that unbridled audacity of yours, swaggering about as it does now? Do not the nightly guards placed on the Palatine Hill, and not the watches posted throughout the city? Does not the alarm of the people and the union of all good men, does not the precaution taken of assembling the Senate in this most defensible place, do not the looks and countenances of the venerable body here present have any effect on you? Do you not see that your conspiracy is already arrested and rendered powerless by the knowledge which everyone here possesses of it? What is there that you did last night? What the night before? Where is it that you were? Who was there that you summoned to meet you? What design was there which was adopted by you, with which you think that any one of us is unacquainted? Shame on the ages and on its principles. The Senate is aware of these things, the Council sees them, and yet this man lives. Lives, aye. He comes even into the Senate. He takes part in the public deliberations. He is watching and marking down and checking off for slaughter every individual among us. And we, gallant men that we are, think that we are doing our duty to the Republic to keep out of the way of his frenzied attacks. You ought, O Catiline, long ago to have been led to execution by command of the council. That destruction which you have been long plotting against us ought to have already fallen on your own head.
Okay, now look at this video from Justice Scalia. He's not speaking to a public audience. He's not speaking to his colleagues or the lawyers in the courtroom. He is speaking in the Senate. Now, he does what he just said one ought to do. He gets right to the issue up front, and he does so in a rather surprising way to some people in terms of what he says is very important to focus on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm happy to be back in front of the Judiciary Committee where I started this pilgrimage. I am going to get even more fundamental than my good friend and colleague. Like him, I speak to students, especially law students, but also college students and even high school students, quite frequently about the Constitution, because I feel that we're not teaching it very well. I speak to law students from the best law schools, people presumably especially interested in the law, and I ask them, how many of you have read the Federalist Papers? And well, a lot of hands will go out. No, not just number 48 and the big ones. How many of you have read the Federalist Papers, cover to cover? Never more than about 5%. And that is very sad. I mean, especially if you're interested in the Constitution. Here's a document that says what the framers of it thought they were doing. It's such a profound exposition of political science that it is studied in political science courses in Europe. And yet we have raised a generation of Americans who are not familiar with it. So when I speak to these groups, the first point I make, and I think it's even a little more fundamental than the one that Stephen has just put forward, I ask them, what do you think is the reason that America is such a free country? What is it in our Constitution that makes us what we are? And I guarantee you that the response I will get, and you will get this from almost any American, including the woman that he was talking to at the supermarket, the answer would be freedom of speech, freedom of the press, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no quartering of troops in hope, those marvelous provisions of the Bill of Rights. But then I tell them, if you think that a Bill of Rights is what sets us apart, you're crazy. Every banana republic in the world has a Bill of Rights. Every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. I mean it literally. It was much better. We guarantee freedom of speech and of the press. Big deal. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. Whoa, that is wonderful stuff. Of course. Just words on paper.
Okay, so the third canon of Cicero is memory. Now, back then, and even in the early part of our country on orations, they memorized their speeches. Memory work, unfortunately, is not that common even in lower schools anymore. It's a training of the mind that many have lost. But in giving speeches today, relatively few are memorized. It's usually from notes, bullet points or whatever, maybe a PowerPoint, it may be a teleprompter, whatever. And that is affecting the whole business of memory. But of course, lawyers still have to memorize all the facts of the case, basically, all the issues when they go into court. In terms of public oration, first of all, we don't have that many. But if we do, they're usually by presidents, and they're working off teleprompters. That doesn't mean that memory isn't important. It's important in a different way, and that is making your argument memorable. Now, in the Declaration and the Constitution, they used to be memorized by students in the 19th century. That doesn't happen much today at all, except for maybe the first two paragraphs of the Declaration. What makes something memorable, though? So, just repeating a few of the famous lines, "Give me liberty or give me death" by Patrick Henry, memorable. It's repeated often, and it is relatively short. And by the way, as McDonald points out, it was borrowed from a play. So we have nothing to fear but fear itself, a famous line from FDR's first inaugural during the Depression. We have "I Have a Dream," Martin Luther King. That's repeated over and over again, a line that is very memorable. And from Reagan, President Reagan, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." Very memorable. In fact, I wish they would play it more. Why? In Eastern Europe, it became the real spur to hope and energy. Many East Europeans will tell you that Reagan's speech had a tremendous impact. By the way, his speechwriters tried over and over again to take that line out of his speech, but he insisted on putting it in nevertheless, and he delivered it brilliantly. So back to Scalia and Garner again. The way you can make an impact is often through a powerful close. As they say, persuasive argument neither comes to an abrupt halt nor trails off in a grab bag of minor points. Unfortunately, some speakers do that. The art of rhetoric features what is known as the peroration, the conclusion of argument, which is meant to move the listener to act on what the preceding argument has logically described. The concluding paragraph of legal argument cannot, of course, be as emotional as a peroration of Cicero's first oration against Cadillac. That's what we're going to play. But it should perform the same function appropriately for the different context or different audience. So let's hear the close from Cicero.
Though there are some men in this body who either do not see what threatens or dissemble what they do see, who have fed the hope of Catiline by mild sentiments, and have strengthened the rising conspiracy by not believing it, influenced by whose authority many, and they're not wicked, but only ignorant, if I punished him, would say that I had acted cruelly and tyrannically. But I know that if he arrives at the camp of Manlius to which he is going, there will be no one so stupid as not to see that there has been a conspiracy, no one so hardened as not to confess it. But if this man alone were put to death, I know that this disease of the Republic would be checked only for a while, not eradicated forever. But if he banishes himself and takes with him all his friends, and collects at one point all the ruined men from every quarter, then not only will this full-grown plague of the Republic be extinguished and eradicated, but also the root and seed of all future evils. We have now for a long time, O conscript fathers, lived among these dangers and machinations of conspiracy, but somehow or other, the ripeness of all wickedness and this long-standing madness and audacity has come to a head at the time of my consulship. But if this man alone is removed from this piratical crew, we may appear, perhaps, for a short time relieved from fear and anxiety, but the danger will settle down and lie hid in the veins and bowels of the Republic. As it often happens that men afflicted with a severe disease, when they are tortured with heat and fever, if they drink cold water, seem at first to be relieved, but afterwards suffer more and more severely. So this disease, which is in the Republic, if relieved by the punishment of this man, will only get worse and worse as the rest will still be alive. Wherefore, O conscript fathers, let the worthless be gone. Let them separate themselves from the good. Let them collect in one place. Let them, as I have often said before, be separated from us by a wall. Let them cease to plot against the consul in his own house, to surround the tribunal of the city praetor, to besiege the Senate house with swords, to prepare brands and torches to burn the city. Let it, in short, be written on the brow of every citizen what his sentiments are about the Republic. I promise you this, O conscript fathers, that there shall be so much diligence in us, the consuls, so much authority in you, so much virtue in the Roman knights, so much unanimity in all good men, that you shall see everything made plain and manifest by the departure of Cadillac, everything checked and punished. With these omens, O Catiline, be gone to your impious and nefarious war, to the great safety of the Republic, to your own misfortune and injury, and to the destruction of those who have joined themselves to you in every wickedness and atrocity. Then do you, O Jupiter, who are consecrated by Romulus with the same auspices as this city, whom we rightly call the stay of this city and empire, repel this man and his companions from your altars and from the other temples, from the houses and walls of the city, from the lives and fortunes of all the citizens, and overwhelm all the enemies of good men, the foes of the Republic, the robbers of Italy, men bound together by a treaty and infamous alliance of crime, dead and alive, with eternal punishments.
Well, here we are in section 3, and the only problem is we don't have enough time to get through it. So what I'm going to do is to postpone it until the next session, and we'll work it into it quite seamlessly, I hope. In any event, we will also address some of the student questions next week. As far as the materials go for next week, we will have available on the Federalist Society book club for this book club, Reasoned Argument, writings from James Otis and John Adams, but also I will include a chapter from the book Ethics of Rhetoric. So we will talk about all of these things together. But before leaving, what I want to do is acknowledge and thank those students that have been assisting me in this project to this point. I wouldn't have been able to get there without them. So, in alphabetical order, Thomas Bickle, thank you. Michael Gray, thank you. Thomas Murray, thank you. Ben Elliott, thank you. And Simon Wang, my former student, thank you.